Hey guys, it's Krista Watson here from Krista Quilt, and I'm excited to tell you how I like to bind my quilts. I'm going to demonstrate using this Modern Logs quilt shown behind me. If you'd like to make one just like it, check out the description box below for all of the information. So come on in, let's take a look. Now it's time to square up the quilt. I start in all four corners of the quilt with the largest square ruler that I can find, and I'm trimming off the batting and backing flush with the quilt. I'm not leaving any extra batting to fill the binding. My binding is going to get wrapped around nice and tight. After I trim off the four corners, then I'm going to trim off the sides in the same way. This time I'm using a 6x24 ruler, and I'm making sure the ruler lines up with the edges so that my cuts are nice and straight and clean. I'm going to do this all the way around the quilt, and it will be clean and ready for binding. Now that the quilt is all trimmed up, it's time to sew the binding strips together and attach them to the quilt. Now when it comes to binding strips, you have options. I like to cut my binding strips 2 inches wide so they finish about 1/4 inch on both sides. I'm going to sew it together with my 1/4 inch dual feed foot on my Bernina, and it's going to make a nice, thin, crisp binding. Now when it comes to a scrappy quilt, a lot of times I will make a scrappy binding. I'll just use leftovers and sew the strips together. You have 2 options when it comes to sewing the strips together. You can either sew them together on the corner to create a miter, or you can join your strips end to end. In just a second, you'll see demonstrations of both. First, let's take a look and see what it looks like if you want to sew your binding strips together on a mitered angle. Overlap your strips at a 90-degree angle when sewing mitered corners. You can trim off the excess later. Now let's take a look and see what it looks like if you're joining your strips end to end. The only reason I do that is if I'm doing a scrappy binding and I don't want any seams to show because I'm sewing a light and a dark fabric together. That's called shadowing, and I want to avoid that as much as possible. For straight seam joins on your binding, use a 1/4 inch seam and press your seams open. A really easy way to calculate how much binding you'll need around your quilt is take the perimeter, all 4 sides around the quilt, and add 10 inches. That's going to let you know how many binding strips you need to cut. The information for Modern Logs is included in the pattern, but here's an easy way to calculate that. For example, if your perimeter was 200 inches and you're cutting with width of fabric strips, or 40 inches, you would take 200 divided by 40, and that would be the number of strips you'd need to cut, rounding up. Before attaching the binding to the quilt, you first want to press it in half, wrong sides together, all the way along the length. If you've cut 2-inch wide strips, this will make sure that your strips are now 1 inch wide. Start on any side and leave yourself at least 5 or 6 inches of starting tail when you sew. This will be important later. When you get to a corner, you want to fold up your fabric and stop stitching a 1/4 inch away. Stitch off the edges and do what I call the funky fold. Pull the fabric strip up so that it's flush with the sides, and then fold itself back on itself once again. I'm going to show you this a couple of times so you get the hang of how this fold looks. Once again, you want to stop a 1/4 inch away from the seam, bring the binding strip all the way straight up and then back on itself so that it's nice and flush and even. By folding it precisely in this manner, you will create the miter as you sew the binding onto the quilt. Continue stitching with a 1/4 inch seam all the way around all 4 sides of the quilt. When you reach the end of the binding, you want to stop stitching with about 5 or 6 inches at the end. So in other words, you have a starting tail and an ending tail. Then lay out the ending part of your binding on top of the quilt. Lay the beginning part of your binding inside of that and mark a line where the 2 places meet. Add 1/2 inch for seam allowances on both sides of the binding. Join the binding strips together and pin them, then sew them together and press the seam open to complete your loop of binding. Once you've joined your binding strips together, you want to close the gap and completely stitch down the rest of the binding so it's securely attached to the front of the quilt. Once the binding is completely attached to the quilt, I like to press it away from the quilt so that it creates a crease, making it much easier to finish sewing it on the other side. Now that your binding is all attached to your quilt, you can decide, do you want to finish by hand or machine? I do both interchangeably, but for this particular quilt on Modern Logs, I wanted to have a nice crisp finish with hidden stitches, so I sewed it by hand. Here's what that looks like. Use clips to hold down the binding while you stitch it. I like to use them especially at the corners, and I don't have to use pins. Flip the corner miter so that it's going in opposite directions on both sides of the quilt. To make a quilter's knot, you want to take your thread and wrap it 3 times around your needle. Pull it with your hand on the other side to create a knot. If your knot is too small, you can do this 2 or 3 times to create a larger knot. When hand sewing, you want to hide each stitch in the fold of the binding. I will start by pulling the thread through the fabric binding and hiding the knot in the end of the binding. That's going to get covered up when I make it all the way around the quilt. I will take 1 small stitch at a time. I'm going to start off a little bit behind where I first started stitching, and I'm going to make 1 stitch at a time. Continue stitching all the way around the binding. You'll notice that I'm holding the quilt with the bulk of it away from me, and I'm stitching from right to left. You may find it more comfortable stitching from right to left to right, or with the quilt towards you. There's no wrong way to do it. Just do what's comfortable. When you get to the corners, you want to stitch down the back of the corners closed and the front of the corners closed. If you're using a thread that blends in with your binding fabric, that really helps. I'm only using 1 strand of thread at a time. I'm using Aurifil 50 weight cotton. It's nice and strong yet thin, and it blends very nicely into the binding. When I'm about to run out of thread, I will make another knot and hide that in the binding and cut that off. Then I'll start with a fresh piece of thread and continue going. I only want about 16 inches of thread at a time so that it doesn't knot up on me. This process is really fun and really relaxing, so give hand binding a try. I think you'll like it. Well, there you have it. That's how I put the binding on my Modern Logs quilt. Remember, if you'd like to grab the pattern or anything else to make this quilt, check out the description box below. Remember, you don't have to do everything I say. If you can take 1 or 2 tips from my technique and put them into your own process, that's okay by me. I hope you enjoyed it and have a happy sewing day.